A few hundred soldiers stood on a foreign shore with an intact Persian army behind them and a sealed sea in front of them. 2 columns had already been destroyed. 2 commanders were dead. The men who remained had no road forward and no route home. They were not trapped by accident. Their governor had been ordered by Caliph Umar not to invade Fars. He invaded it anyway. Southern Persia, 638 AD. Khalid ibn al-Mundhir's soldiers held their position near the coast and watched the horizon. The sea should have been their escape route. It was the same route that had carried the expedition out of al-Bahrain and into Sassanid territory. Now Persian ships and coastal defenses had closed it. Behind the surviving column stood the forces of Shaharak, the military governor of Fars. His army had already destroyed the 2 Arab columns that entered the province before Khalid. There was no reason to believe he could not destroy a third. The men on the shoreline knew enough to understand their position. They could not advance deeper into Fars. 2 commanders had already attempted it. Neither had returned with an army. They could not withdraw by sea. The route was blocked. An overland retreat through unfamiliar and hostile territory offered no reliable escape. So they remained where they were. They built a defensive position and waited for an enemy that could choose the time of the next attack. They also waited for help from Arabia, without knowing whether anyone in Medina had received word of the disaster. The surviving accounts do not preserve the thoughts of the ordinary soldiers. They do not record what was said inside the camp when confirmation arrived that the other columns were gone. There is no complete diary from the shoreline, no list of private fears, no detailed account of every day spent under containment. The strategic facts are enough. 2/3 of the expedition had been destroyed. The final third had been cut off, and the man responsible for sending them into Fars had acted against a direct order from the Caliph. This was not the result of a misunderstood instruction. Umar Ibn Khattab had not left the question open to interpretation. He had told al-Hadrami not to attempt the conquest of Fars. He had warned him not to seize its surrounding islands or expand the operation. Al-Allah knew the limit. He crossed it. That decision did not come from an unknown officer or an untested governor. Al-Allah had built a serious record before the disaster. He had served in al-Bahrain, the broad eastern Arabian coastal region facing the Persian Gulf. He had held authority during one of the most unstable periods in the early caliphate. After the death of the Prophet Muhammad, rebellion spread across Arabia. Political alliances broke. Tribal loyalties shifted. Regions that had accepted the authority of Medina began testing whether that authority would survive. Al-Bahrain was one of those exposed territories. The region stood close to Sassanid influence. It had commercial value, maritime access, and political networks older than the emerging Islamic State. Losing it would not have been a minor administrative failure. It could have reopened Persian influence along the Arabian coast and encouraged further rebellion. Al-Allah did not lose it. He confronted a rebellion connected to the Banu Lakham, a tribal and dynastic tradition with long ties to the former Lakhmid kingdom. For generations, the Lakhmids had served as Arab allies and military proxies of the Sassanid Empire. Their name still carried political weight. Al-Allah defeated the rebellion and kept al-Bahrain under the authority of Medina. That victory established him as more than a tax collector or provincial administrator. He became a trusted frontier governor. Abu Bakr retained him. Umar also allowed him to remain in office. He had earned confidence through action. That history matters because the campaign against Fars cannot be dismissed as the work of a man who had never commanded under pressure. Al-Allah had faced a real crisis before. He had made decisions while authority was fragile and communication with Medina was difficult. He had acted decisively and succeeded. Success created the reputation that protected his position. It may also have created the confidence that destroyed his judgment. At some point during Umar's caliphate, al-Allah organized a naval operation across the Persian Gulf. Maritime warfare was still unusual for Rashidun forces. Most major campaigns depended on land movement, cavalry across open ground, infantry before fortified cities, and supply routes stretching through conquered territory. Crossing the Gulf required something different. Ships had to be gathered, men and supplies had to be loaded. Open water had to be crossed without the naval tradition of a major maritime empire behind them. Al-Ala completed the crossing and seized a foothold in Sassanid territory. It was a real achievement. The operation proved that the Gulf was not an absolute barrier. It showed that a force based in al-Bahrain could strike across the water and survive. It gave Al-Ala a position from which he could look toward Fars, one of the most important provinces still under Sassanid control. Fars was not an empty frontier. It was a Persian heartland. It carried economic value, military resources, and symbolic importance. The ancient centers of Persian royal identity stood within the wider region. Any commander who entered Fars was not merely raiding a distant coast. He was entering territory the Sassanid state had defended for centuries. Umar understood the difference between seizing a limited foothold and opening a full invasion. He ordered Al-Ala to stop. The governor did not stop. The sources do not preserve a letter in which Al-Ala explains himself. There is no reliable record of him declaring that Umar was wrong. There is no surviving confession of ambition. What remains is the sequence of actions. Al-Ala had crossed the sea and won. He saw Fars within reach. He continued raiding into the territory Umar had placed beyond his authority. Then he began organizing a force large enough to attempt a conquest. The distinction is critical. This was no longer a brief border action taken during an emergency. It was a planned military escalation against an enemy province that still possessed a functioning command structure. Al-Ala divided the expedition into 3 columns. Al-Jarud ibn al-Mu'alla commanded the first. Al-Sawwar ibn Hammam commanded the second. Khalid ibn al-Mundhir commanded the third. On paper, 3 columns could spread confusion, threaten multiple positions, and prevent an enemy from concentrating its defense. But that logic depended on the condition of the enemy. Fars had not collapsed. Its military governor, Shaharak, commanded organized forces. Sassanid provincial defenses remained active. Garrisons, local troops, intelligence networks, and coastal resources were still available. Al-Ala had divided his army before an enemy that still knew how to concentrate its own. He did not create 3 simultaneous threats. He created 3 smaller targets. Years later, successful Rashidun campaigns would use divided forces against Sassanid territories, whose command systems had already been broken by major defeats. Fars in 638 was not in that condition. This was before the later destruction of central Sassanid resistance at Nahavand. Shaharak was not commanding the remains of a defeated province. He was defending an organized one. The first column crossed into Fars under al-Jarud. The detailed movements of the battle have not survived. There is no reliable reconstruction of every formation, maneuver, or defensive position. The record preserves the outcome with greater clarity than the process. Al-Jarud's force was defeated. The column was destroyed. Al-Jarud was killed. For the remaining soldiers, this was the first proof that the campaign plan had failed. The first column had not opened a route. It had not weakened the Persian defense enough for the other forces to exploit. It had ceased to exist as an effective army. News traveled toward the second and third columns. The men continued moving through a campaign that had already begun consuming its commanders. If you're listening from somewhere far from the shores where these soldiers were trapped, comment your city, state, or country below. Let us see how far this warning from 638 AD has traveled, and how many people are still willing to remember the men who were ordered into a campaign they did not design, then left to face the consequences of a governor's disobedience. The second column was still in motion. Shaharak's army remained intact, and Al-Ala's invasion had passed the point where one retreat order could easily undo what had begun. Al-Sawar ibn Hammam's column continued into Fars after the destruction of al-Jarud's force. By then, the campaign had already changed. The original plan had depended on movement, separation, and pressure from several directions. That plan was now broken. One of the three columns had been eliminated before the others could create any meaningful strategic advantage. The Sassanid command had not been confused. It had concentrated. Shaharak's forces had identified the weakness in al-Allah's deployment and acted before the separated Arab units could support one another. Al-Jarud's death was not an isolated battlefield loss. It was proof that the defensive system inside Fars remained capable of finding a column, containing it, and destroying it without exposing the province to collapse elsewhere. The second column now moved under that knowledge. There was no reliable way to pretend the first force had simply been delayed. Survivors, messengers, or scattered reports carried the result through the expedition. The first commander was dead. His men were no longer advancing. The road ahead had already been tested and had already failed. Al-Sawar still had soldiers under command. He still had orders connected to the invasion. But the military situation no longer resembled the one for which those orders had been issued. This was the point where a disciplined operation should have been reassessed. It was not. The second column pressed forward into the same province, against the same organized defense, with no evidence that Shaharak's strength had been seriously reduced. The sources do not preserve a detailed sequence of formations or individual engagements. They do not record an extended exchange between Al-Sawar and the surviving commanders. There is no reliable account of a council in which withdrawal was proposed and rejected. The outcome is what remains. The second column was defeated. Al-Sawar's force was destroyed. Another commander was lost. In a short span of time, two of the three forces al-Allah had sent into Fars had ceased to function as armies. This was no longer an invasion suffering heavy resistance. It was a military disaster. The scale of the failure should not be softened by the language of expansion or frontier warfare. These men had not been lost while defending al-Bahrain from attack. They had not been surrounded after obeying an urgent command from Medina. They had crossed into a province that Umar had specifically ordered al-Allah not to invade. Two commanders were now dead because that restriction had been ignored. The surviving third column, led by Khalid ibn al-Mundir, received the consequences before it received any clear solution. The remaining men understood the pattern. Shaharak had defeated one separated force and then another. His army remained capable of further action. There was no indication that Persian resistance was close to breaking. There was no liberated city waiting to support the invaders, no secure road opened by the previous columns, and no combined formation large enough to restore the original strength of the expedition. Khalid had one responsibility left: prevent the final column from becoming the third destroyed force. He stopped behaving like a commander pursuing conquest. He began acting like a commander preserving survivors. The surviving soldiers tightened their formation and took a defensible position. The exact ground is not described in sufficient detail to reconstruct every feature, but Khalid's achievement is clear. He prevented Shaharak from immediately repeating what had already been done twice. That distinction matters. The first two columns had entered Fars and been eliminated. Khalid's men remained organized under pressure. They did not break into scattered groups. They did not abandon their command structure. They did not give Shaharak an easy conclusion to the campaign. Persian forces pressed them, but Khalid held. For the first time since the invasion began, one of al-Allah's commanders stopped the sequence of rapid destruction. It was not a victory. It did not restore the dead. It did not recover the lost columns. It did not make the invasion lawful, successful, or sustainable. It only kept the final group alive. That was enough to create a new problem for Shaharak. A direct assault against a prepared defensive position could cost men and time. The Sassanid commander did not need to rush. He controlled the province. He possessed local support, interior movement, and access to coastal defenses. Khalid's column was the isolated force, not his. The logic of the campaign reversed completely. Al-Ala had crossed the Gulf believing that Fars could be pressured from several directions. Now the last Arab force was the one being pressured from every direction that mattered. The sea became the decisive weapon. The expedition had depended on ships from the beginning. There was no secure land corridor connecting the eastern Arabian coast to the interior of Fars. The water route had carried troops, equipment, and supplies into the operation. It was also the only practical route out. Sassanid naval elements and coastal defenses moved to close it. The surviving soldiers could see the consequences before any formal announcement was needed. Vessels that might have carried them back toward al-Bahrain could no longer move freely. The coast was no longer an exit point. It had become the edge of a prison. Khalid could hold Shaharak's army away from his immediate position. He could not command the sea. The men now faced a set of choices that existed only in theory. They could advance deeper into Fars, following the route that had already consumed 2 columns. They could attempt to force a maritime withdrawal against a blockade prepared by the same enemy that controlled the shoreline. They could turn toward an overland escape through hostile territory without a secured supply line or a known route back to friendly ground. Each option risked completing the destruction Shaharak had already begun, so Khalid held his position. The surviving column waited near the coast, while the Sassanid command controlled the distance around it. There was no need for Shaharak to attack every day. Containment itself created pressure. Every delay weakened the trapped forces' freedom of action. Every blocked vessel reminded the soldiers that the route home no longer belonged to them. The men could look across the water toward Arabia, but the Gulf gave them no answer. They did not know when Medina would learn what had happened. Communication across the region required messengers to escape the crisis, find transport, and carry news through the administrative chain. Even if a report reached Umar, the trapped men had no way to know that it had arrived. This uncertainty was part of the punishment, though they were not the ones who had defied the order. Al-Ala had made the decision. Al-Jarud and Al-Sawar had paid for it first. Khalid's men were now paying for it slowly. The campaign had begun with the governor testing the limits of central authority. It had become a group of soldiers, waiting to see whether that same authority could reach them before the Sassanids did. Far away in Medina, the disaster was moving toward Umar. When the news arrived, the Caliph would face 2 separate failures. One was political. A trusted governor had deliberately acted beyond his command. The other was immediate. Hundreds of soldiers remained trapped because of it. Removing Al-Ala could punish disobedience. It could not open the sea. It could not bring back the dead. And it could not save Khalid's column unless another army was ordered to enter the crisis that Al-Ala had created. The first reports reached Medina without ceremony. There was no victory procession, no captured standard, no envoy announcing the fall of Fars. The message carried the opposite. 2 columns destroyed, 2 commanders dead, the surviving force trapped against the Persian coast. For Umar Ibn Khattab, the disaster was not difficult to understand. Al-Ala had been warned. The order had been direct. Do not invade Fars. Do not expand the operation. Hold the position already taken. The governor had acted anyway. Umar did not treat the result as an unfortunate battlefield reversal. He treated it as a breach of command that had already cost lives and was still placing more soldiers in danger. Al-Ala was removed from the governorship of al-Bahrain. The decision was immediate. There was no attempt to protect his reputation because of his earlier service. No effort to disguise the invasion as a misunderstanding. Al-Ala had once helped preserve the region during rebellion. He had earned trust through years of frontier administration. But past service did not erase present responsibility. This was the judgment at the center of Umar's response. A commander could be valuable and still become dangerous. The removal solved one problem. Al-Ala no longer controlled the province from which he had launched the unauthorized campaign. He could no longer gather ships, issue new orders, or send additional men into the same failure. But the men already inside Fars remained trapped. Administrative punishment could not reach the shoreline. Khalid ibn al-Mundhir still held the surviving column together, while Shaharak controlled the surrounding province. The Sassanid blockade still denied them the sea. The destruction of the first two forces had not been reversed by dismissing the man who sent them. Umar now had to rescue soldiers from an operation he had forbidden. That distinction defined the crisis. The Caliph was not reinforcing al-Ala's conquest. He was containing its damage. Authority moved quickly from judgment to action. An experienced replacement was placed over al-Bahrain. Some accounts identify Uthman ibn Abi al-As as the man who assumed control during this period. He was not being sent into an ordinary provincial transition. He was entering a government whose military leadership had just been discredited and whose forces had suffered a major defeat across the Gulf. The province needed more than a new name at the top. It needed discipline restored. Ships, supply routes, coastal defenses, and military commands had to be returned to central control. The same machinery al-Ala had used to launch the invasion now had to be prevented from creating a second one. At the same time, Umar turned toward Basra. The city was still developing into the military base it would later become, but its strategic purpose was already clear. Basra offered a controlled position near the Gulf, connected to the campaigns in southern Iraq and capable of supporting movement toward Persian territory. Its existence mattered because improvisation had already failed. Al-Ala had acted from personal judgment and local opportunity. The rescue would be organized through an established command system. Umar ordered Utbah ibn Ghazwan to prepare assistance for Khalid's trapped force. Utbah was not being asked to conquer Fars. His task was narrower and more urgent. Reach the surviving column, break the conditions holding it in place, and prevent the unauthorized campaign from ending in total destruction. Men were gathered, transport was arranged, supplies were prepared for troops who might already be short of time. The response required coordination across distance. Medina issued the command. Basra assembled the force. The Gulf route had to be approached despite Sassanid pressure. Information about Khalid's position had to be turned into a workable rescue plan. This was the work al-Ala had bypassed when he decided that momentum was enough. Momentum had taken him across the water. It had not given him secure reinforcement routes. It had not protected 3 separated columns. It had not prepared a response for defeat. Now other commanders had to construct those protections after the disaster had already begun. On the Persian shore, Khalid could not see any of this. His men remained contained. They knew the first 2 columns were gone. They knew the sea route was blocked. What they did not know was whether Umar had received the news, whether a relief force had been ordered, or whether help could reach them before Shaharak changed his strategy. A trapped army measures time differently. Every day without attack may appear to be survival. It may also be preparation by the enemy. Shaharak did not need to prove his strength again. He had already defeated al-Jarud and al-Sawar. Khalid's resistance had forced him to use containment rather than immediate destruction, but the balance of power had not changed. The Sassanids controlled the interior. They controlled the approaches. They interfered with the water route. Khalid controlled only the ground his men could defend. That was not enough to end the crisis. The surviving column maintained order because disorder would have completed Shaharak's work. Guards remained in position. Movements had to be controlled. Supplies had to be protected. Any attempt to scatter toward the coast or search for separate escape routes would expose smaller groups to capture or destruction. Khalid's command became an exercise in refusing panic. There was no promise of victory to sustain the men. The invasion was already lost. Their only remaining objective was to survive long enough for an external decision to reach them. That survival depended on the same central authority their governor had ignored. The contrast was severe. Al-Ala had acted as if distance from Medina gave him freedom. Khalid's men now depended on Medina because local initiative had left them with no freedom at all. The relief force moved from Basra under a different logic from the invasion. It was not divided into disconnected columns and pushed blindly into an intact provincial defense. Its purpose was not to seize symbolic territory or force Umar to accept a completed conquest. It was designed to open a route. That required pressure against the blockade and coordination with the trapped force. Khalid had to remain in position long enough for assistance to reach him. The rescuers had to approach without becoming another isolated target. The Sassanids had to be forced to divide their attention between containing Khalid and confronting a new force supported from outside the province. For the first time since the campaign began, the Arab command was no longer allowing Shaharak to choose every condition. The arrival of reinforcements changed the shape of the confrontation. The trapped column was no longer alone. Sassanid forces now faced pressure connected to Basra, backed by a command structure that understood the purpose of the operation. The goal was limited, but limited objectives are often what prevent military disasters from expanding. The blockade began to lose its certainty. Movement became possible where none had existed before. Khalid's men were not yet safe, but they were no longer waiting for an answer that might never come. An answer had reached the coast. It came too late for al-Jarud. It came too late for al-Sawar. It came too late for the two columns already destroyed, but it came before Shaharak could erase the final one. The rescue had begun. And al-Ala, the governor who had started the invasion, would have no command over how it ended. The relief force did not arrive to recover a conquest. There was no province to secure, no captured capital to defend, and no battlefield success waiting to be completed. Its task was simpler and more severe. Open a route before the final Arab column was destroyed. Khalid ibn al-Mundhir had preserved his men long enough for outside intervention to become possible. That was the only advantage remaining from the original campaign. The Sassanid command still controlled Fars. Shaharak's forces still held the interior approaches. Persian naval and coastal elements had made the Gulf dangerous enough to prevent a normal withdrawal. The rescuers had to change that balance without repeating al-Ala's mistake. They did not advance as three separated forces searching for independent victories. They moved with a limited objective and a clear chain of command. Their success would not be measured by territory seized. It would be measured by whether Khalid's soldiers remained alive when the operation ended. The surviving sources do not provide a complete tactical account of the relief. They do not identify every vessel, formation, or clash along the coast. What they preserve is the result. The isolation of Khalid's column was broken, and the trapped soldiers were given a route out. That outcome required pressure in more than one direction. Until the relief force appeared, Shaharak could contain Khalid while keeping the sea closed. The trapped column had no partner outside the cordon. Every movement exposed it. Every failed attempt to reach the coast could have divided the survivors into smaller groups. The arrival of reinforcements ended that control. The Sassanids now had to respond to a force approaching from beyond the containment zone. Their attention could no longer remain fixed entirely on Khalid. The blockade, effective while the surviving column stood alone, had to withstand an organized challenge supported from Basra. For Khalid, the moment demanded restraint. A desperate commander might have mistaken the first sign of help for permission to charge. That would have exposed his men before the route was secure. The purpose was not to break out through one uncontrolled rush. It was to coordinate movement with the relief force and deny Shaharak the chance to destroy the survivors during withdrawal. The soldiers waited for the opening to become real. Along the coast, the confrontation tightened. Ships maneuvered. Coastal positions were pressured. Sassanid forces attempted to preserve the barrier that had turned the shoreline into a prison. The blockade did not need to be annihilated completely. It only needed to lose control of the route long enough for men to move. That distinction mattered. The Rashidun command was no longer chasing the kind of decisive triumph al-Ala had imagined. It was accepting the limits of the situation and acting within them. A controlled retreat was now more valuable than another reckless victory attempt. When the passage opened, Khalid began moving his force. The withdrawal could not erase what had happened before it. The men leaving the Persian shore were not the same expedition that had crossed the Gulf. Two columns were absent. Their commanders would not return. Equipment, manpower, and authority had been lost in a campaign that had achieved none of its stated purpose. The surviving column moved because another command had corrected the conditions created by the first. Some of the men crossed back toward al-Bahrain, others withdrew toward Basra. That division reflected more than geography. Al-Bahrain was the province from which the unauthorized invasion had been launched. Basra represented the emerging military system that had been used to contain its failure. The survivors returned without the symbols normally associated with conquest. They carried no proof that al-Alaa's judgment had been vindicated. Their survival proved the opposite. The campaign had become recoverable only after his authority was removed from it. This was the final humiliation of the invasion. The governor who had ignored Medina's restriction could not rescue the men endangered by his own decision. The Caliph he had disobeyed had to mobilize another commander, another base, and another force to bring them out. There was no need to invent a public confrontation between Umar and al-Alaa. The administrative action was accusation enough. Al-Alaa was dismissed from al-Bahrain. His control over the Gulf frontier ended. The same region he had once defended during rebellion was taken from him because he had converted trusted authority into unauthorized war. The speed of the removal sent a message beyond one governor. Success did not place a commander above instruction. Previous service did not grant ownership over soldiers' lives. A frontier official could not create policy merely because distance made immediate supervision difficult. Umar's response was not an attack on initiative itself. The early conquests depended on commanders capable of acting under pressure and adapting to local conditions. But initiative had boundaries. Al-Alaa had crossed them without an emergency forcing his hand. He had not disobeyed to save a besieged city. He had not advanced because communication with Medina had failed during a sudden enemy attack. He had been told not to invade a specific province. He prepared the invasion after receiving that order. The distinction made the consequences unavoidable. In al-Bahrain, leadership now had to be rebuilt under a new governor. Military units had to be accounted for. Coastal resources had to be reorganized. Families and communities would have learned that men sent across the Gulf were not returning. The records do not preserve every name among the dead. That absence should not be confused with insignificance. Military histories often retain the names of commanders while reducing the ordinary soldiers beneath them to numbers. In this campaign, even the numbers are incomplete. What remains is the structure of loss. 3 columns departed, 2 were destroyed, and the third survived only because an emergency force reached it. The dead could not participate in the argument over responsibility. The evidence spoke for them. Al-Alaa had believed Fars could be taken before the central government was prepared to support the attempt. Shaharak proved otherwise. He used an intact defense against separated forces and defeated them in sequence. Khalid then proved that discipline could still preserve men after the invasion plan had collapsed. Utbah's intervention proved that organized support could accomplish what isolated ambition could not. And Umar's decision proved that the state would not allow the reputation of one governor to conceal the scale of the failure. The surviving soldiers left the coast. Shaharak remained in Fars. The province had not fallen. The Sassanid military governor, who destroyed 2 columns, was still in command of the territory al-Alaa had tried to seize. The unauthorized campaign had damaged Arab forces without removing the Persian defense. The rescue ended the immediate emergency, but it did not close the case. Al-Alaa had lost his governorship, yet his full fate remained unresolved. He was an experienced administrator, whom Umar had once trusted. The question now was whether one catastrophic act of disobedience had ended his usefulness completely, or whether the Caliph would place him somewhere else and force him to live beneath the consequences of the men he had failed. Al-Alaa did not return from Fars as a victorious governor. He returned to a political reality that had already moved beyond him. His authority over al-Bahrain was gone. The province had been placed under new leadership. The rescue of Khalid's men had been organized without him. The surviving soldiers had been removed from danger by a command system that no longer trusted him to control the crisis he had created. This was not a temporary rebuke. It was a formal separation between al-Ala and the frontier that had defined his career. For years, al-Bahrain had been the proof of his usefulness. He had administered it, defended it during rebellion, and maintained Medina's authority across a difficult region facing the Persian Gulf. His name had been attached to stability. Now the same province became the evidence against him. The ships had sailed from its coast. The 3 columns had been organized under his authority. The dead commanders had entered Fars because he continued after Umar told him to stop. No later explanation could change the order of events. The punishment was severe, but it was not absolute. Some traditions state that Umar reassigned al-Ala to Basra. The detail is important because Basra was not an empty post or a place of ceremonial exile. It was becoming one of the most important military and administrative centers in the eastern expansion of the Caliphate. If the reassignment occurred as reported, Umar did not erase al-Ala from public service. He removed him from independent control. That was a more precise judgment. Al-Ala still possessed experience. He understood coastal Arabia, taxation, provincial administration, tribal politics, and the pressure of governing near Sassanid territory. Those abilities had not disappeared because of one failed invasion, but the failure had demonstrated what happened when those abilities operated without restraint. In al-Bahrain, al-Ala had acted from a position of local authority. Distance from Medina had given him room to make decisions quickly. His earlier victories had made such autonomy appear productive. Basra would have placed him inside a different structure. The city was built for coordinated war. Troops moved through it under wider strategic direction. Supplies could be counted, reinforcements could be assembled. Campaigns into Persia could be connected to decisions made beyond a single governor's judgment. A reassignment there would not have restored the freedom al-Ala once held. It would have placed him close to the system that had rescued the men he endangered. There is no preserved confrontation in which Umar forced him to account for every dead soldier. No reliable transcript records al-Ala defending his decision before the Caliph. The silence leaves no room for invented speeches. The administrative facts are enough. He was removed. Another governor took his place. The surviving army was rescued by someone else. His next position, if the tradition is correct, would have carried responsibility without the same independence. The state still had use for him. It no longer had the same confidence in him. That distinction may have been harder to endure than complete dismissal. A disgraced commander can claim he was rejected by men who never understood him. A reassigned commander must continue serving inside the system whose judgment has exposed his failure. He must watch others take control of the work he once believed belonged to him. Al-Ala began the journey toward Basra. The sources do not preserve a detailed route or a day-by-day account. They do not record whether he traveled under guard, with an official escort, or as an administrator moving to a new assignment. They do not preserve his final thoughts. What they preserve is the end. Some accounts place his death around 641 or 642 before he reached the post he had been assigned. He died on the journey. There was no second campaign, no restored governorship, no battlefield victory to reverse the memory of Fars. The opportunity to prove that the disaster had been an exception disappeared before he could take command again. His death did not settle the argument over his character. It made the argument permanent. Al-Ala remained a man with 2 records. The first showed a capable governor who had helped preserve al-Bahrain during a period of rebellion. He had confronted a movement connected to older Lakhmid power and had defended a strategically exposed region when the early caliphate could not afford to lose it. The second showed a governor who received a direct order, decided not to obey it, divided an invasion force before an intact enemy, and lost most of that force in a campaign Medina had never authorized. Neither record cancels the other. That is what makes the case more serious. If al-Ala had been incompetent from the beginning, the lesson would have been simple. Poor commanders create poor outcomes. Remove them early, and the danger ends. But al-Ala had been competent. He had succeeded under pressure. He had earned Umar's trust. The danger came after the trust was earned. His previous record did not prevent the disaster. It helped make the disaster possible by giving him the authority, confidence, and resources to act beyond the order he had received. This pattern appears repeatedly in military history. A commander wins under one set of conditions. He begins to treat the method of that victory as proof of personal judgment. Then the conditions change, but his confidence does not. Al-Allah had crossed water and seized a foothold. That did not mean he possessed the naval strength to sustain a major invasion. He had defeated rebellion in al-Bahrain. That did not mean he could defeat the organized provincial army of Fars. He had acted decisively during earlier instability. That did not give him the right to replace Umar's strategy with his own. The failure was not courage. The men in the three columns had courage. Al-Jarud advanced with the first force. Al-Sawar continued with the second. Khalid held the third together after the original plan collapsed. The failure was command. Courage was spent trying to repair it. While Al-Allah's career ended on the road, Shaharak remained in Fars. The Sassanid governor had survived the entire confrontation. He had used the province's military structure as intended: identify the invasion, isolate its divisions, destroy the exposed forces, and seal the escape route of the survivors. He had not been removed. He had not been forced from his territory. Fars remained under Sassanid control. This fact denied Al-Allah even the argument that his unauthorized action had weakened the province enough to justify the sacrifice. The invasion had exposed Persian strength more clearly than Persian weakness. But the failure also gave Medina information. The route across the Gulf had been tested. The danger of separated columns had been demonstrated. The need for naval and logistical support could no longer be treated as secondary. The strength of Shaharak's defense had been measured at a severe price. Those lessons would matter when the Caliphate returned. It would return without Al-Allah. The next invasion would not depend on one governor deciding that success had placed him above instruction. It would be organized with central approval, supported through established bases, and commanded by men who understood that Fars could not be taken through momentum alone. The province had defeated the first attempt. It had not escaped the second. And when the armies returned, Shaharak would recognize some of the command structure approaching him. Among those connected to the next campaign would be the same leadership that had restored order after Al-Allah's dismissal. The men who cleaned up the disaster were preparing to complete the conquest. This time, they would not arrive as three isolated columns sent forward by a governor trying to prove Umar wrong. They would arrive because Umar's government had decided the time was right. 5 years after the failed expedition, Fars was still under Sassanid control. Shaharak remained associated with its defense. The province had survived Al-Allah's attempt because its military structure had not collapsed. Its commanders had acted in coordination, and the invading force had been divided before it could establish a secure position. The Rashidun command had not forgotten the defeat. It had also not forgotten why the defeat occurred. The next movement against Fars would not begin with a governor deciding that a previous victory gave him permission to ignore Medina. It would begin with authorization, preparation, and a command structure capable of sustaining men after they crossed the Gulf. In 643, Uthman ibn Abi al-As returned toward Fars. He was connected to the administration of al-Bahrain after Al-Allah's removal. He had already seen the political and military damage left by the unauthorized campaign. He understood that this province could not be treated as a quick coastal prize. The difference was visible before the armies met. Al-Allah had crossed first and expected success to justify the decision afterward. Uthman moved with approval already secured. Al-Allah had divided his force into 3 columns before an intact provincial army. The later campaign was supported through a wider military system with established bases and a clearer relationship between local command and central authority. Al-Allah had entered Fars without a reliable response to blockade or defeat. The new operation was launched after Basra had demonstrated its value as a staging ground, reinforcement center, and logistical anchor. These were not administrative details. They were the difference between an army that could be rescued and an army that did not need to be rescued immediately after landing. Military histories often describe later success as proof that the earlier target had always been vulnerable. That interpretation conceals the real sequence. Fars was not easily available in 638. Shaharak had proved it. He had destroyed 2 Arab columns, contained a third, and preserved the province. The first invasion had not failed because one minor decision went wrong during battle. It failed because the entire operation rested on an assumption that the Sassanid defense could not coordinate fast enough to punish separation. That assumption was false. The later campaign began from the evidence of that failure. Routes had to be controlled, reinforcements had to remain reachable, naval transport could no longer be treated as a temporary bridge that would remain open simply because the first crossing succeeded. The invading force needed enough strength to survive contact with the provincial army, and enough support to prevent one setback from becoming complete isolation. Uthman's returned the structure of the expedition, but not the full human account inside it. Their names disappeared. Their families' reactions disappeared. The communities in al-Bahrain that lost men to the campaign were reduced to silence because the surviving histories were built around governors, caliphs, and provinces. This is how command failure becomes clean on the page. A force is described as destroyed. A commander is listed as killed. A replacement is appointed. The narrative advances. But the dead do not advance with it. They remain inside a sentence written to explain why another campaign required better preparation. The later return to Fars benefited from their loss. The commanders knew that Shaharak could identify isolated columns and destroy them in sequence. They knew the Sassanid coastal system could turn the sea against an expedition. They knew that Fars was not a weak frontier district waiting to collapse under the appearance of Arab troops. That knowledge had been purchased in 638 by men who were never asked whether al-Alaa's judgment should override Umar's order. Shaharak was still connected to the defense of the province when the Rashidun forces returned. His survival carried its own warning. He had not been disgraced by the first campaign. He had performed his duty effectively. He had defended Fars, destroyed the separated forces entering it, and prevented the surviving column from withdrawing without outside intervention. He now faced a different kind of enemy. The first invasion had arrived as an unauthorized gamble. The second came with state support. That change did not make the fighting less dangerous. It made the Rashidun force less vulnerable to the exact method Shaharak had used before. The confrontation was no longer between one provincial governor's ambition and an intact Sassanid defense. It was between 2 organized military systems. Fars had resources, local authority, and the legitimacy of defending its own territory. The Rashidun command had the advantage of learning from failure and the capacity to return after absorbing it. That capacity is one of the least sentimental realities of imperial warfare. States can survive disasters that destroy the individuals sent to carry them out. The dead cannot revise the plan. The institution can. The first expedition was defeated, but the Caliphate preserved its command network, replaced the governor, rescued the survivors, strengthened Basra, and returned later under different conditions. From the perspective of the state, the failure became information. From the perspective of the soldiers who did not return, it remained final. The later campaign into Fars would eventually succeed where al-Alaa had failed, but that success should not be used to excuse the first invasion. A later victory does not retroactively transform an unauthorized disaster into necessary preparation. It does not prove that al-Alaa had been correct and merely unfortunate. The timing, command structure, and support were different. Those differences were the entire case against him. He had attempted to force the future before the Caliphate was prepared to sustain it. When the state returned, it did so after assuming the responsibilities he had neglected. The conquest of Fars also introduced a wider moral problem that military narratives often avoid. The Rashidun forces were no longer only defending Arabian territory or suppressing rebellion. who returned with authorization, inherited both the target. They were entering a Persian heartland, governed, defended, and inhabited by people who did not view themselves as empty space between military objectives. The source account concentrates on commanders and campaigns. It does not provide enough evidence to reconstruct specific policies toward civilians during this operation. Those details cannot be honestly invented, but their absence should not be mistaken for the absence of civilians. Armies crossed inhabited territory. Supplies had to be taken, purchased, or redirected. Fortifications stood near settlements. Provincial resistance depended on local labor, taxes, transport, and information. Every campaign described as a movement between strategic points passed through communities whose experiences were rarely recorded by the men issuing the orders. The same historical silence that removed the ordinary Muslim soldiers from al-Alaa's failed expedition also obscured the Persian civilians living inside the province being contested. The archive favored the state on both sides. It remembered Shaharak because he commanded. It remembered Uthman because he returned. It remembered Umar because he authorized or prohibited logic connecting 638 to 643. One commander's disobedience produced disaster. The state punished him, absorbed the loss, corrected the method, and returned. The system proved its discipline not by abandoning expansion, but by making expansion harder to defeat. Fars had survived the first invasion because al-Ala arrived before the machinery behind him was ready. It faced the second after that machinery had learned exactly what the first failure required. The later conquest of Fars did not erase the disaster of 638. It buried it beneath a more successful campaign. Once the province was taken through authorized operations, the first invasion could be reduced to a failed preliminary attempt. The sequence became convenient, an early setback, a correction, then expansion. In that version, the dead men of al-Jarud and al-Sawwa's columns became little more than the cost of learning. That interpretation protects institutions. It does not protect the truth. The expedition of 638 was not simply defeated by a stronger enemy. It was sent forward after a direct restriction had been issued. Its commander divided the force before an intact provincial defense. 2 isolated columns were destroyed. The third survived because Khalid ibn al-Mundhir stopped pursuing conquest and concentrated on keeping his men alive. The rescue came from outside the original command. That is the central fact. Al-Ala al-Hadrami had once defended al-Bahrain when rebellion threatened the authority of Medina. He had earned trust through effective administration and military action. He had crossed the Persian Gulf and demonstrated that maritime operations were possible. Then he mistook capability for permission. The later success in Fars does not prove that his judgment was strategically sound. It proves that the province required what Umar had understood from the beginning: preparation, reinforcement, secure command, and an operation supported beyond the ambition of one governor. Al-Ala had one part of the necessary system. He had ships, he had soldiers, he had confidence. He did not have authorization, sufficient support, or a credible plan for failure. The men under him discovered that a mission only after they entered enemy territory. Al-Jarud's column was the first to learn that Shaharak's defense remained coordinated. Al-Sawwar's force confirmed it. Khalid's column inherited the evidence and was left to survive inside it. Military reports preserve these events as outcomes: defeated, destroyed, killed, trapped, rescued. The terms are accurate, but they create distance. They make disaster appear administrative. A column disappears from the campaign and the narrative shifts to the next commander. But military units do not disappear. They are broken into individual deaths, injuries, missing men, abandoned equipment, and families waiting for people who do not return. The surviving source does not preserve those families' names. It does not record the houses in al-Bahrain where the consequences arrived. It does not tell us how many widows were informed, how many parents waited, or how many men vanished without a body being recovered. That silence is not proof that the suffering was small. It is proof that the record was not designed to preserve it. The archive followed authority. It recorded Umar because he issued the prohibition and ordered the rescue. It recorded al-Ala because he disobeyed. It recorded Shaharak because he commanded the defense. It recorded the Arab officers because they led the columns. The ordinary Muslim soldiers appear only as force strength and loss. The Persian civilians appear even less. Fars was not unoccupied ground. It was a functioning province containing settlements, agricultural systems, religious institutions, roads, estates, and communities tied to the Sassanid state. When armies returned in later years, those people faced taxation, military movement, changes in political authority, and the uncertainty that follows conquest. The available account does not describe those civilian experiences in detail. It would be dishonest to invent them, but it would be equally dishonest to narrate the conquest as though only commanders inhabited the province. Empires reduce land to objectives. Military histories often follow the same habit. Fars becomes a target. Al-Bahrain becomes a base. Basra becomes a staging point. The Gulf becomes a route. Human communities are transformed into terrain. That language is efficient. It is also incomplete. The campaign of 638 reveals the machinery beneath expansion more clearly than a victory narrative does. It shows how decisions are made above the men who carry them out, how ambition can spend lives before the state has accepted the risk, and how later success can conceal the responsibility attached to earlier failure. Umar's response prevented a larger catastrophe. He removed al-Ala. He restored control over al-Bahrain. He ordered assistance from Basra. He ensured that Khalid's surviving column was not abandoned. This demonstrated institutional discipline. It also revealed the limit of discipline after the damage had begun. A caliph could dismiss a governor. He could not return the dead commanders to their columns. He could open a route for the survivors. He could not restore the two forces already destroyed. He could authorize a better campaign 5 years later. He could not make the first campaign necessary. Al-Ala's final position remains difficult because the evidence does not allow a simple moral portrait. He was not only the man who disobeyed Umar, he was also a governor who had served during rebellion and helped preserve a vulnerable region. He was not only reckless, he had demonstrated real competence. That is why his failure matters. Dangerous decisions are not always made by men without ability. They are often made by experienced men who begin treating earlier success as protection against later error. Al-Ala had reasons to believe in himself. He had no right to make hundreds of soldiers carry the consequences of that belief after the strategic limit had been clearly set. His death before reaching a possible new assignment prevented any final correction. There was no later administration through which he could restore trust. No recorded campaign allowed him to prove that Fars had been a single failure rather than the result of a deeper flaw. His career ended divided. The state remembered his service. The disaster remembered his disobedience. Shaharak's position was also temporary. Fars would eventually fall under sustained Rashidun pressure. The Sassanid system he defended was already fighting for survival across several fronts. But in 638, Shaharak had won. That fact should remain clear. He defeated an invading army because he used concentration against separation, local command against overextension, and coastal control against a force dependent on the sea. The first invasion did not expose Sassanid weakness. It exposed Rashidun indiscipline at the frontier. The wider caliphate survived because Umar refused to protect the reputation of the man responsible. The governor was removed. The remaining soldiers were recovered. The military system learned. That is the institutional lesson. The human lesson is darker. Those killed in the first two columns did not benefit from the correction. They became the evidence that persuaded later commanders to prepare more carefully. Their loss strengthened the system that had failed them. History often calls that adaptation. The dead might have called it too late. Subscribe for more dark military histories in which official victories conceal the decisions, failures, and forgotten communities beneath them. Then comment your city, state, or country below and tell us your theory. Did al-Ala act from strategic conviction, from pride after his first naval success, or from the belief that victory would make his disobedience impossible to punish?